In 1953, South Korea's GDP per capita was lower than Ghana's. Let that sit for a moment. Lower than Ghana, lower than Sudan, lower than most of sub-Saharan Africa. The Korean War had just ended. Half the peninsula was rubble. Life expectancy was under 50. Literacy was a luxury. Roughly 2/3 of the population worked in subsistence agriculture. There was no stock exchange, no banking system worth mentioning, no industry to speak of. Today, South Korea is the world's 13th largest economy. It produces more semiconductors than any country on the planet. It gave you the phone in your pocket, possibly the television on your wall, and almost certainly the memory chips in your laptop. Samsung alone, one company, generates revenue equivalent to about 20% of South Korea's entire GDP, from rubble to microchips in roughly 60 years. That is not a miracle. Miracles don't have blueprints. This had a very specific blueprint, and when you see what that blueprint actually looked like, you might be surprised that anyone agreed to it at all. Here's why you should care about this story right now. The global semiconductor shortage that began in 2020 cost the automotive industry alone over $200 billion in lost revenue. Factories sat idle. Cars sat unfinished on production lines. The U.S. government declared chip supply a matter of national security. And the question that every major government started asking was, how do we build what South Korea built? The CHIPS Act, the EU CHIPS Act, China's trillion-dollar push for semiconductor self-sufficiency. These aren't just industrial policy. They're attempts to replicate a model that South Korea essentially invented. A model that, when you actually look at it up close, involves the kind of decisions that no modern democratic government would probably survive today. Because what South Korea did wasn't just hard work and good timing. It was a calculated, state-directed bet on specific industries, specific companies, and a specific vision of what the country needed to become. And it required an extraordinary amount of pain on the way. Let's start at the beginning. By any measure, post-war South Korea was not a promising candidate for industrialization. The country had almost no natural resources, no oil, no significant mineral wealth. The terrain is mostly mountainous, which limits agricultural output. It was surrounded by hostile neighbors, North Korea to the north, a Japan it deeply distrusted to the east, and a Cold War superpower standoff playing out across the entire region. Its only meaningful asset was people, a population that was young, increasingly literate, and, after the trauma of occupation and war, deeply motivated. The first president, Syngman Rhee, tried a standard approach: attract foreign aid, build basic infrastructure, stabilize the currency. It worked, slowly. The economy limped forward, but the growth was fragile and shallow. Then in 1961, a general named Park Chung-hee seized power in a military coup, and everything changed. Park was not a Democrat. History is unambiguous about that. He ran an authoritarian government, suppressed political opposition, and ruled by decree. But he was also, by nearly every economic measure, extraordinarily effective. He had a theory, and the theory was this: South Korea couldn't afford to grow organically. It didn't have time. It was surrounded by existential threats, dependent on U.S. military protection, and too poor to invest in everything. So it would invest in almost nothing, except a few specific industries, which it would then force to compete globally or die. That theory had a name. The Koreans called it guided capitalism. Economists call it the developmental state model. And it's one of the most studied, most controversial, and most imitated economic experiments in modern history. Here's how it actually worked. The Korean government took control of the banking system. Every major bank was state-owned or state-directed. This meant the government controlled who got loans and who didn't. Credit in 1960s South Korea wasn't distributed by the market. It was distributed by bureaucrats with a plan. The plan was to pick industries: steel, chemicals, shipbuilding, electronics. industries that required massive capital investment, that had long development timelines, and that most private investors, if left to their own devices, would never have funded in a country with no track record. The government would then identify specific companies, Korean family-owned conglomerates, and flood them with cheap credit, tax incentives, and protection from foreign competition. In exchange, those companies had to meet export targets. Miss the target, and the credit line gets cut. Hit the target, and you get more. These conglomerates became the chaebol. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Daewoo, SK. You know the names today. In the 1960s, they were construction companies, sugar refineries, and trading houses being handed a government mandate to become something much larger. Samsung's founder, Lee Byung-chul, started in dried fish and noodles. The government essentially told him, here is capital, here is protection, now go build electronics. This was not subtle. The government set 5-year plans, borrowed directly from the Soviet model, which is its own kind of irony, given South Korea's ideological position during the Cold War, and then engineered the financial system to make those plans happen. And the exports started growing, textiles first, then light manufacturing, then chemicals, then heavy industry. By the mid-1970s, South Korea was building ships that rivaled Japan. By the early 1980s, it was exporting cars. By the late 1980s, memory chips. The growth rates were surreal. South Korea sustained GDP growth of over 8% per year for nearly 30 years. In the 1960s, real per capita income roughly tripled. In the 1970s, it roughly tripled again. The economists called it the miracle on the Han River. But miracles have hidden costs, and this one had several.
Let's talk about what all of this actually cost. First, labor. South Korea's industrialization was built on wages that were kept deliberately low. Workers in the 1970s and 1980s worked some of the longest hours in the industrialized world, routinely 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week, for wages that were suppressed to maintain export competitiveness. Strikes were illegal. Independent unions were crushed. The workforce that built the Korean miracle was also the workforce that was most systematically excluded from its initial benefits. Second, concentration of power. The chaebol model didn't just create big companies, it created a handful of families with extraordinary economic and political power. By the late 1980s, the top 5 chaebol accounted for more than half of South Korea's exports. The entire economy had become structurally dependent on a few family-controlled empires. That's an enormous systemic risk to build into a country's foundation. Third, debt. The cheap credit that fueled the miracle had to come from somewhere. Korean banks were directed to lend to chaebol at below-market rates, which meant the banking system was quietly accumulating risk at scale. The chaebol borrowed and borrowed, expanded and expanded on the assumption that the government would never let them fail. For a long time, the government didn't. Then came 1997. The Asian financial crisis hit South Korea like a wall of water. The currency collapsed, the stock market lost half its value, the banking system, stuffed with bad loans to over-leveraged chaebol, nearly seized up entirely. Daewoo, one of the largest conglomerates in the country, eventually went bankrupt with debts of over $80 billion. The Korean government had to go to the IMF for a $58 billion bailout, one of the largest in history at the time. And then something remarkable happened. South Koreans lined up, literally. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens brought their gold jewelry, rings, necklaces, family heirlooms to collection centers and handed them over to help pay the country's foreign debt. The government melted it down, over 225 tons of gold. It's one of the most extraordinary voluntary acts of collective sacrifice in modern economic history. They paid the IMF loan back in 3 years, ahead of schedule. But the crisis also forced a reckoning with the chaebol model. The government broke up some conglomerates, reformed corporate governance, liberalized the financial sector. It was painful, disruptive, and deeply controversial. And yet, the tech engine kept running. Now, let's get specific about semiconductors, because this is the part of the story that almost didn't happen. In 1983, Samsung's chairman Lee Byung-chul announced that Samsung was going to enter the memory chip business. His own engineers thought he was out of his mind. The Japanese had a near-total monopoly on DRAM chips. Intel had essentially invented the market. South Korea had no semiconductor expertise, no manufacturing infrastructure, and no significant customer base. Lee flew to the United States, licensed technology from American chip companies, recruited Korean engineers who'd been working in Silicon Valley, and told them to build a factory. They built it in 6 months. That's not a typo. 6 months. Samsung lost money on semiconductors for years, hundreds of millions of dollars. The losses were so severe that multiple divisions within the company argued for shutting the whole thing down. Lee kept funding it. And then, Japan's chip industry ran into antitrust problems with the U.S. government. American companies, faced with Japanese competition they were losing on price, pushed for trade restrictions. A 1986 trade agreement hammered Japanese chip makers with quotas and forced them to raise their prices. The market opened up, briefly but crucially. Samsung was ready. They had spent years refining their process, their yields improved, their prices fell, and they had capital, government-directed capital, to keep scaling. By 1992, Samsung was the world's largest producer of DRAM chips, a 9-year journey from total outsider to global leader. The Japanese companies never fully recovered. SK Hynix followed a similar path. Today, those two Korean companies, Samsung and SK Hynix, together produce roughly 70% of the world's DRAM chips, the chips that sit in almost every server, smartphone, and computer on the planet. Think about what that number means geopolitically. 70% of the world's DRAM production runs through one small country the size of Indiana. This is why Washington, Beijing, and Brussels are all simultaneously trying to figure out how to replicate what Korea built, and simultaneously terrified of being dependent on it. Now, let's be honest about a few things the success story tends to leave out. South Korea's model worked partly because of conditions that almost certainly cannot be replicated. The U.S. provided security guarantees that freed the government from having to spend as much on defense as it otherwise would have. American markets were largely open to Korean exports during the critical growth decades, a privilege that was partly geopolitical. South Korea was a Cold War ally. Cheap global capital flowed freely. And crucially, South Korea was doing this in the 1960s and 1970s, before the WTO rules existed that now prohibit the kind of industrial subsidies and credit direction that powered Korean growth. Every country that has tried to copy the Korean model in recent decades has discovered, usually expensively, that the world has changed. The rules have changed. The competitive landscape has changed. There's also the social cost that doesn't appear in the GDP numbers. South Korea today has one of the highest suicide rates in the OECD, one of the longest working hours, an intensely competitive education system that is genuinely brutal on children, a birth rate so low, currently around 0.72, the lowest in the world, that demographers describe it as a demographic emergency. South Korea has engineered a society that is extraordinarily productive and extraordinarily stressed. The two things may not be unrelated. The chaebol problem didn't disappear after 1997 either. Samsung's heir, Lee Jae-yong, was convicted of bribery in connection with the political scandal that brought down President Park Geun-hye in 2017. He received a presidential pardon in 2022,
Partly, critics argued, because South Korea's economy is too dependent on Samsung to risk its leadership being in prison for long. When a single company is so important to your country that its chairman gets pardoned from a corruption conviction, you have to ask whether the model has become something you still control or something that controls you. Here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. South Korea's semiconductor dominance is not just an economic achievement, it is a geopolitical pressure point of the first order. China is South Korea's largest trading partner. The United States is its security guarantor. As the U.S.-China rivalry over semiconductor technology intensifies, South Korea is being squeezed from both sides. Washington wants Seoul to restrict chip technology exports to China. Beijing, which buys enormous amounts of Korean chips and is a massive market for Samsung and SK Hynix, is making clear that cooperation with American export controls will have consequences. South Korea is in effect the most important and most vulnerable node in the global semiconductor supply chain. Meanwhile, Taiwan, home to TSMC, which manufactures the most advanced chips in the world, sits in its own precarious position. A conflict on Taiwan would devastate global chip supply in ways that make the 2020 shortage look trivial. Samsung and SK Hynix are the backup that the world would desperately need, which makes South Korea simultaneously more valuable and more exposed. The country that rebuilt itself from rubble is now one of the most strategically important pieces on the global board, which is a remarkable thing to have become, and a genuinely uncertain thing to remain. So, what is the actual lesson here? It's not simply that state-directed industrial policy works. It sometimes does, and sometimes spectacularly doesn't, and the difference usually involves timing, conditions, and a level of political willingness to absorb pain that democratic governments rarely survive. It's not that hard work and national sacrifice guarantee prosperity. They are necessary. They are not sufficient. Maybe the real lesson is this. South Korea succeeded because it made series of enormous, coordinated bets at exactly the right historical moment, absorbed the costs in ways that were deeply unequal, and then reformed hard enough after the 1997 crisis to survive its own model's contradictions. The question worth sitting with is whether that can be repeated intentionally.